Thank you, Paige, and thank you for braving this northeasterly day. So Napoleon, of course, was short, but he wanted to be thought of as larger than life. And the mythology really began relatively early in his career. Here's an example. So this is a brilliant sketch by Antoine-Jean Gros, who was a student of David. We heard a lot about David last time. Also a great propagandist, as we'll see, for Napoleon, showing Napoleon as a general at the bridge of Arcole. This was during his first Italian campaign, and it really was, came down in history as he was successful in this campaign. And this is a moment where he's shown handsome, dashing, seemingly fearless, holding a flag and at the bridge. It's a sketch for a full-length portrait, which doesn't really have the fire that this has, although Napoleon was very pleased with that portrait and actually paid for an engraving to be made out of it. He also appointed Gros to be on the commission that was looking at art that was being taken by Napoleon's armies for possible transport back to France, where works like that were shown at the Louvre. The Louvre originally has been called a trophy of conquest, showing off these things. Now, what Gros also actually had Napoleon sit for him, and as may be suggested by the fiery aspect of this portrait, he said Napoleon was terribly restless and that he could barely get his features down. He wrote that to his mother. And we can really get a sense of that here. And the myth-making around this is really rather striking. Of course, as I said, it was a victory, but it wasn't a victory right away. In fact, when Napoleon led his army to the bridge, at first it really was a standoff, and apparently he fell into a ditch and was covered with mud and had to be pulled out by his troops. And then there were 2 more days of fighting before they really were able to proceed, and eventually it was a victory. But we'd never suspect that from looking at this extraordinary image of General Bonaparte. So last time I showed you this painting, really at the beginning of the lecture, and this really shows it shows Napoleon at the St. Bernard Pass. In the Alps. This was when he was going to Italy, really the second time. This was, and in between was the campaign in Egypt and the Near East, which we'll see shortly. And at this point, Napoleon was first consul. That he had already had his coup d'état in 1799, and was really on his way to this ultimate consolidation of power. And I talked about last time how David, remember, who was the teacher of Gros, who I just showed you, really mythologizes Napoleon, not only having him loom up above those tiny soldiers, but also the way that, carved in the rocks along with his name, Bonaparte, you have the names of Hannibal and Charlemagne written as Carolus Magnus, these great precedents for crossing the Alps at this perilous pass to lead an army into Italy. And I also mentioned the mythologizing here that Napoleon, in fact, went across on a mule, which made a lot more sense, but certainly is not as glamorous. I wanted to show you a fascinating painting from 1808, which shows really the same event, not Napoleon this time, but some common soldiers at the St. Bernard Pass during this campaign. And rather than having the heroics, the full-blown heroics of the David portrait, what we have here is a scene of a soldier having his legs sort of bandaged by a camp next to a campfire. It's really a lovely outdoor scene. It's quite large. It's more than 6 feet high, and it was originally intended as a wall decoration. That's what it was originally. But it really represents the kind of, you could say, everyday life scene, what we could call a genre scene, that was actually very popular at the time. Your people weren't, unless you were purchasing for a palace or something, you wouldn't be getting something like this on the left, like an official commission, but perhaps something more like this that is somewhat in the spirit of what were called the little Dutch masters. Think of somebody like Vermeer, Peter de Hoogh, those kinds of artists who did anonymous scenes from everyday life. And it's really shown with this lovely atmospheric effect of the snow, but obviously without the kind of grandeur of what we're looking at on the left. Now, that takes us to one of the paintings in the galleries upstairs, which the MFA is fortunate to have. It's a painting by an artist named Auguste Hyacinthe de Bay, but it's a copy of a very, very famous painting in terms of Napoleonic propaganda, again by Gros, Antoine-Jean Gros. And it's known as General Bonaparte visiting the plague-stricken at Jaffa, or Napoleon at the pest house of Jaffa. And the story here, and I've just learned from an audience member who probably knows way more about Napoleon than I, that it's actually Jaffa is the present-day Joppa in Israel. And the story here is rather extraordinary. I wanted to show you this is the full-scale painting in the Louvre. It's absolutely enormous. I mean, we're talking about something that has roughly life-size figures, gigantic with, architecture and everything. So what had happened here, and this is a painting now from 1804, where it shows an event that took place in 1799. This was in between the two Italian campaigns. It's generally called the Egyptian campaign, but it was in more than just Egypt. And what had happened is that Napoleon's army had taken a number of prisoners, and Napoleon just couldn't deal with them. It's just, well, we're not going to, have to feed these people, so he had them shot. And what happened later was also horrifying, which is that bubonic plague broke out. And this affected everyone, and there was terror. And Napoleon, who really had extraordinary physical bravery, wanted to show that it was, we didn't need to panic about this. So he entered this makeshift hospital, which is actually in the court of a mosque, which it's known as the pest house at Jaffa. And he actually, and this apparently really happened, he touched the bubo, the bubonic plague sore of one of the ill men to show that he wasn't afraid. And this is what Gros shows, but with a great deal of glamour and mythologizing. So what we have here is there's Napoleon, beautifully, glamorously costumed, and if you go to the Museum of the Invalides in Paris, where they, the military museum, you can see these extraordinary costumes that they wore at that, in those in Napoleon's campaigns. And he is touching the sore of this man, seemingly completely fearless. And what this conjures up is Christ healing the sick, or even the Christian motif of Saint Doubting Thomas putting his finger in Christ's wound. There also was an old myth about medieval, really going back to the Middle Ages, about French kings, that when they were crowned, they could cure scrofula, that, it was called the king's touch, that they could heal. So Napoleon, all of these aspects are being put onto Napoleon. And remember last time I was showing you things like The Death of General Wolfe by Benjamin West and the Watson and the Shark by John Singleton Copley, and I talked about those as modern history paintings, something from recent history that's being mythologized, shown with grandeur, with all the kind of battery and stage work of what we could call a history painting. That's what's going on here. I mentioned that those, I really call them Anglo-American paintings because West and Copley were both originally from the colonies, West from Pennsylvania, Copley from Boston, but they had their careers largely in England. I mean, West actually became the president of the Royal Academy eventually, but I mentioned that the formula that they came up with, taking a current event and aggrandizing it, this was going to be the basic stuff of propaganda painting in the 19th century, after those late 18th century works. And we're going to see a number of examples of this, both pro-Napoleon and anti-Napoleon. That's where we get to the discontents later on. And here's a detail of the painting, the sort of exoticism of this. It's what is now known as Orientalism. So Orientalism, it really has pejorative associations. I mean, going back to, I guess it was 1978, when the literary scholar Edward Said wrote a book called Orientalism, really as a kind of demeaning perspective coming from Europe onto people from, say, North Africa, the Near East, the Ottoman Empire, associating them, for example, with laziness or with a sort sort of exoticism, which in a way is stereotyping. So it's an example of that, but it also is a way of distancing the audience back home from the horrors of the war or the bloodshed, because it becomes sort of exotic with this really extraordinary kind of setting. So I want to show you another absolutely gigantic, you could call these propaganda machines by Gros again. So this one is called Napoleon on the Battlefield of Eylau, which was shown in the Salon of 1808. And at this point, of course, Napoleon is emperor. We're going to hear more about that shortly. So in this one, and again, it's one of these modern history paintings. It's something where the artist has brought together all kinds of factual things in order to convince you that this is factual, when in fact the main action and the message are really completely mythologized. So we have Napoleon riding onto this frozen battlefield. So this took place, what was in 1807, and Napoleon was fighting the Russians, who were backed up by the Prussians. And it was a horrible battle. It really was, Napoleon declared it a victory, but it wasn't much of a victory. It really was a terrible stalemate where you had something like 30,000 soldiers on the French side, killed or wounded, and then 25,000 on the other side. Really extraordinary. And the victory part really just came from the fact that the enemies, the France's enemies left earlier. And so it was, they left the battlefield. But you can see how Gros has taken great pains in the background, showing the troops arrayed, tried to make it sort of topographically correct, to make it look authentic. The freezing setting, with the snow and the ice. And I'll show you in a moment some really grisly details, like frozen blood on a bayonet in the foreground. And amidst all of this horror of the dead and the dying in the foreground, you have Napoleon riding in on this beautiful steed. It looks like he's giving a gesture either of blessing or perhaps clemency, forgiveness, but having this noble bearing. And again, just as the pest house at Jaffa suggested, say Christ healing the sick, this is a saintly. This is a very saintly thing coming in. There's a great saint who divided his cloak, for a beggar who, suggesting that. And you can see how one of the enemy looks like he's trying to, kiss his spurs. Why would he be embracing Napoleon? And there is a man who looks like he's dying and half frozen in the foreground who is saluting Napoleon. You can also see that there looks like a French medic who is helping one of the enemy. The whole thing is really, the whole thing is really set out to be a kind of, grand mythifying mythologization or mythification. And one of the other things about putting all those bodies in the foreground is that they are foreshortened. When I talk about foreshortening, so my arm is now foreshortened. It's not, if you look at it like this. It's when things are coming at you sort of perpendicular to what we would call the picture plane, perpendicular to your eyes. And it tends to, when you see that in a picture, especially in the foreground, it pulls you in. And so you're being pulled into the scene psychologically, and also, thinking that this is actually something that's authentic. And just a few details, like the look of the enemy who's being treated by the French doctor or medic, and here this frozen corpse with the frozen blood on the bayonet, really trying to convince you of the horror to set off, Napoleon, riding in so nobly on that horse. So that brings us to another grand propaganda painting. And this time it's by David, who by this point, at the time of this painting, was now first painter to the king. So that, remember I mentioned that actually was, I'm sorry, first painter to Napoleon. That was like the role over in Spain, how I mentioned how Goya had become first painter to the king. And it's really interesting to think about the very divergent sort of trajectories of these two artists that really overlap in time. We'll cut back to Goya shortly. But this commemorated an event that took place on December 2nd of 1804, and it's a very large painting in the Louvre, the coronation of Napoleon. The French call it the Sacre, and you can see that it was painted over several years. It took David quite a while, and then it was shown in the Salon of 1808. Now, this is really extraordinary, the idea of an imperial coronation, because remember last time we were looking at the French Revolution, where they hated kings, they hated monarchy, and executed King Louis XVI and his queen Marie Antoinette. So this is really extraordinary how we're bringing back not just royalty, but the empire, bringing back, the empire. And Napoleon was, the coronation took place, in a way that, both looks back. This is really typical of Napoleon. There's, you think of the Roman god Janus, who looks backward and looks forward with, the two faces. On the one hand, you could say he's looking forward in the sense that he continues certain traditions of the French Revolution. I mean, he starts out really as a revolutionary general, but he also goes back and continues traditions from the past. Not just the centralization that we had, say, under Louis XIV, but also, as we'll see, bringing back Catholicism to France after it had really been persecuted, during the Revolution, where they had, I was telling you last time, what we call de-Christianization. And that had already happened. We'll hear more about that in a moment by the time of this painting. And, what happened is that, in terms of looking forward and looking backwards, the coronation did not take place in the traditional place where French kings were crowned. Traditionally, they were crowned in the Cathedral of Reims, which is near, basically where they make champagne, that region. And instead, Napoleon was crowned, or he crowned himself, as we'll see, at Notre Dame, which is the main cathedral of Paris. But the interior was sort of got up with this sort of temporary decor by his architects, Percier and Fontaine, in sort of neoclassical style. So it sort of brought it all up to date. So this is another one of these modern history paintings. He has lots of elements in there that are really there to persuade you that this really happened in this way, but it also has lots of sleight of hand and stagery going on at the same time. So one of the things that's really remarkable is that he has this great number of portraits. And David was a great portraitist. They really are quite persuasive. But notice how only Napoleon, who's holding up the crown, who's about to crown the Empress Josephine, his wife, only they are in profile, almost as if, from a coin. You could call them Augustan profiles, like from a coin or a medal from ancient Rome. Everyone else is, turned a little bit one way or the other because these are really just mortals. And the thing that's so amazing is, David, and we'll see this also with his student Ingres, was able to shift his style, shift the kind of references, the historical references, the art historical references in his style to match the occasion. So in this case, he was really thinking about, and I'm sorry it's not labeled, it's on your sheet, this is the coronation scene, the coronation of Marie de Medici from a great cycle from the 17th century by Rubens, the Marie de Medici cycle, which is now in the Louvre. I think at the time it was in the Luxembourg Palace in Paris. And what David has done is he's taken some of that rich, the reds and the golds, the rich atmosphere, the paint. He's brought all of that into his coronation scene. It's also interesting to look at this really charming painting by Louis-Léopold Boilly, which shows the painting, and I'm partly showing you this so you can get an idea of the size, as it was being looked at by the crowd. And the idea that this is a painting that really was a kind of public spectacle that people would come and see. I mean, Boilly is someone who really had this great eye for the crowd, for the common, the life of the common people. Really a charming artist. He also went in for trompe l'oeil, fool the eye. For example, over at the Harvard Museum, there's a painting that looks like a print, like an engraving, where it even looks like the plate was pressed into the paper, but it's all fake. It's all just painted. Kind of wonderful that way. But I want to come back to a detail of the actual painting with Napoleon raising the crown, and to suggest how different the style that really looks like, say, a 17th century Rubensian style, is different from what we saw from that austere, Spartan, stoical style that we saw during the height of the French Revolution, during the Reign of Terror, with the death of Marat, which we saw last time, where everything is so spare. This one is so rich, and that goes along with the whole the whole sort of difference in attitude, in ideology at this time. Now you'll notice that bishop in the holding that. Holding the crozier in the background. You can see also those profile views of Napoleon and Josephine. And what I wanted to mention was that, as I said, well, for one thing, Napoleon actually crowned himself, and David originally was going to show that, but perhaps was a little too controversial. It was announced to the Pope, who you can see sitting rather helplessly in a chair behind Napoleon. It was announced to the Pope shortly before the ceremony that Napoleon was going to do that. I mean, that really was traditionally more the ecclesiastical job rather than somebody doing that for themselves. So what does all of this have to do with the Church and Catholicism? Well, here is the Pope Pius VII, who you can see sort of feebly blessing, and you can see he doesn't have the mitre that he has in that drawing. And I mentioned, by the way, I think I showed you a drawing for the Oath of the Horatii last time that had that kind of, squaring up, that sort of graph paper look, and that's really a very ancient technique. Even I think the ancient Egyptians knew how to do that for transferring something smaller onto something larger like a canvas. So something rather remarkable had happened in 1801, which is that Napoleon had made a treaty with the Vatican called the Concordat. It was really kept secret at first. It was announced the next year in 1802. And, as I said, during the French Revolution, especially during the height of the Revolution, the Terror, Christianity was really persecuted. You had this de-Christianization. And what the Concordat it did not say that Catholicism was the official religion of France. That's what the Pope wanted, and he was very disappointed. What it said instead is that Catholicism is the religion of the great majority of the French people. But that was a legitimizing thing, and suddenly Catholicism became very chic. We'll see this later with Chateaubriand and his génie de christianisme, his genius of Christianity, which came out the year that the Concordat was announced, which we'll turn to shortly. But when the Pope came to really to consecrate the coronation, he really was almost like a prisoner. He didn't really have a lot of choice. And David, as I said, was a brilliant portraitist, really captures some of that that sense of being somewhere where he really doesn't have control, because that was a way, you could say, of glorifying Napoleon. One of the things I also wanted to mention about the coronation was that Napoleon wanted, he liked to be compared, say, to Charlemagne. Remember how David, had the name of Charlemagne in the Latin version inscribed in the rocks in the Napoleon at St. Bernard. And for the coronation, Napoleon had a special sword and a scepter that had supposedly belonged to Charlemagne. And they were supposedly restored, in quotes, for the ceremony. Well, they really were made new. They really were, you could say, forgeries. And we're going to see something by the man Odiot, who actually was the silver goldsmith who actually did the work on those later on. So the Concordat, it really, as I said, Napoleon, negotiated this with the Vatican, but there was no question of who was in charge. It really subordinated the papacy to Napoleon, and eventually the government produced what was called the Napoleonic Catechism, where it really was like a catechism, the Catholic catechism, but what it said was that, Napoleon was God's representative on earth, that kind of thing, and that you have the duty to serve in his army, and, really quite extraordinary. And that idea of, mythifying Napoleon to the point where he is, you could say, deified, really is represented most fully in this portrait by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who was David's most brilliant student, Napoleon on his imperial throne from 1806. And 1806 is really a moment, very high in the good fortunes of Napoleon. It's a painting that was not an official commission, unlike the ones that I've been showing you. This was something that Ingres actually did on his own volition, but it was purchased for the legislature, for what was called the Legislative Assembly, that was known as the Assembly of Mutes, because they could suggest laws, but they couldn't discuss them. So this was something they could vote. They could vote on laws, but could not discuss them. So this really was this idea of having this incredibly imposing image seemed suitable for that, and yet at the same time, when it was shown in 1806, it was controversial. It just was in a way too over the top. And it shows Napoleon as if he is either a medieval ruler, like an emperor, or perhaps like the lost statue of Zeus by Phidias, where there were reconstructions of that at the time. He's completely immobile. He has that immobile expression, like a sort of an icon. And the point of view, my dissertation advisor, Bob Rosenblum, described it as a frog's eye point of view. It's as if you're down on the carpet looking up at him. It really is terribly imposing. And the other thing is that in the carpet, you have the Napoleonic eagle in the front, but over on the side, you can see that there's some zodiacal emblems. And it's really interesting that the ones that are showing, there is Virgo, the Virgin, for representing the Concordat, which had recently happened a few years earlier, and there's also Libra, the scales, which is the Napoleonic Code, which was also recent. That was the civil code that Napoleon didn't really write. It was really written by a committee, but he did attend the sessions where they were discussing the prerogative of the husband, and he insisted on that, so that the wife, in effect, had no authority. I mean, this was something that he wanted. But anyway, the sort of detail from this, as well as this image of the immobile, superhuman ruler, that has a resemblance, you could say, to this painting by Jan van Eyck, the 15th century Netherlandish painter. And we're not really sure it either represents Christ the King or God the Father, but it comes from a very famous, very large painting with many panels called the Ghent altarpiece. And I mentioned earlier that Napoleon's armies took works of art where they were brought back to the Louvre as, in triumph. And parts of the Ghent altarpiece were brought back. I believe that this part was as well. And not only do you have that kind of immobile, superhuman figure, but also the kind of detail, that sort of, incredibly almost microscopic detail for jewels and, things like that, the crown. You can also get that in Jan van Eyck. And I'm not sure if Ang was aware of this, but one of the things you also get in the work of Jan van Eyck is what we call hidden symbolism, little details that are meaningful, like those things on the carpet, referring to the Concordat, and also to the, the Napoleonic civil code, the Code Napoleon. So this is what I mentioned before, that in 1801 we have this Concordat, this treaty between Napoleon and the Vatican that really brings Catholicism back, and it becomes very chic. And one of the things that really makes it chic, that makes it fashionable, is this remarkable publication by Chateaubriand called The Génie du Christianisme. It's usually translated as The Genius of Christianity. I've also seen it translated as The Spirit of Christianity, from 1802. And as I said, it came out, at the same time that the Concordat was announced. It's a remarkable book. It was very widely read. It's rather extraordinary in that it's a justification for Catholicism, not on the basis of it being, say, reasonable or, on the basis of authority, but rather because it's the most beautiful religion. And it gives us the most beautiful feelings, and it's inspired the greatest works of literature. In other words, it's a very aesthetic kind of justification based on feeling. And it really was somewhat infectious. It also has a lot of nostalgia for the destroyed, churches that were destroyed during the Revolution. All of the trashing and vandalism that took place, and this nostalgia for all of the kinds of traditions, and there's this whole parallel in the Génie du Christianisme between the great classical works by, say, Homer, and works for, narratives from Scripture, and he concludes that Scripture is superior. And this really started a whole cult, especially of the Old Testament in France. And, the Old Testament was not really it wasn't really directly read before this very often. There were references to it, for example, in the Catechism, but it became a kind of a literary phenomenon, especially for young poets like Victor Hugo a little bit later on, who really identified with the prophets, with Moses. And it's interesting that when Victor Hugo started out his career, he later on he started out very much embracing the monarchy and Catholicism. He later on became someone who we associate with the left. But early on he said, I will be Chateaubriand or nothing. That was really his ideal. So I mentioned that there is this nostalgia for and really dismay at this dismembering and vandalization of the Catholic heritage in France. And I wanted to show you two rather remarkable images that pertain to that. On the left, you see a painting by the French painter Hubert Robert, who was a specialist in ruins. I really think of him more as often more pre-revolutionary, doing these sort of imaginary ruins. But this is a real ruin that he's showing you. It's the destruction of a church. It's no longer there as it was destroyed, but it was once a church in Paris called Saint-Jean-en-Grève. And this painting from around 1800 shows its deliberate destruction. It's kind of remarkable, but right around this time, around 1800 or 1801, something like that, there was exhibited in the Paris Salon, and I've been showing you paintings that were shown in the Salon, by an architect, plans for the quickest way to destroy a Gothic church. I mean, really extraordinary, kind of hair-raising. And what he says is that you go to the piers, the big supporting elements, and make a hole in them, and as you make the hole, fill them with wood, and then you set the thing on fire, and the church collapses, just sort of falls right down, sort of without danger to onlookers very quickly, just in a matter of minutes. And that's really what's going on here. I mean, it's really kind of extraordinary. And the other image is also really very moving. It's a large, maybe so big, damaged head that was originally, I think the figures were about 9 feet tall, spanning the facade of Notre Dame. And they have them there now, but they're not the original ones. The original ones were taken down during the French Revolution. I don't know exactly how the heads were taken off, but these sculptures were sort of thrown in a heap, and the heap was used as a latrine. And then somebody bought them as fill, like, architectural fill for building. And in the 1970s, there was some construction going on a street called the Chaussée d'Antin, and they dug them up. They dug up these heads. So now they're in the museum, the Cluny, which is the great medieval museum in Paris. And they really are extraordinary. So these are, heads that were vandalized. And, there's something about them, that's just deeply moving. There's also there's a paradox about vandalism. When people vandalize art, they're disrespecting it, but they're also admitting that it has power, because otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. And the other thing, the other thing about these extraordinary heads, they really make us think about how, over time, during this period of the French Revolution when, this Catholic art was really scorned, that was, going to change, by the time we get to, say, long before the 1970s. The other thing is that the reason why they took those statues down, and these are basically like Old Testament kings, they were really supposed to be ancestors to the Christ and the Virgin, they thought that they were French kings. And that belief had gone back to the Middle Ages. I mean, even, back early in the history of the cathedral, people thought, oh, those must be French kings. And so, of course, the revolution was so against the monarchy. So Chateaubriand, not only did he write the Génie du Christianisme, but he wrote 2 little novels, novellas, which were originally going to be part of that book. One was called René, and the other one was called Attila. And he then published them separately. They were really quite sensational, I think especially Attila. And Anne-Louis Giraudet-Triasson, who we often just call Giraudet, was another student of David, a brilliant student. I showed you his Endymion last time. And he did this painting, which is in the Louvre, a large painting of the funeral of Attila. So it's quite a sentimental story. It takes place in the New World, or somewhere around, say, Louisiana. And Chateaubriand had actually gone to the New World. He had been in exile during the French Revolution, and he had gone to North America, supposedly looking for the Northwest Passage, but ended up traveling around. And the whole idea that he had been there really had a whole mystique, that really helped the popularity of this novella. So it has to do with this sort of ill-fated love between Chactas, who you see on the left, who is an indigenous man who has escaped from these rather murderous other tribes, and his beloved Attila, who is sort of half indigenous, but she's also Christian. And what happened is that Attila had taken an oath on her mother's deathbed that she would always remain a virgin. And so, since she's in love with Chactas, this presents a problem. Her solution is she takes poison. It's a little bit like kind of almost a Romeo and Juliet story. And she's being lowered into her grave here by this benevolent hermit monk, a French hermit monk, Père Aubry. And what actually, so in the, you don't actually see you don't actually read about the actual burial of Attila in the in the novella, but that's what's taking place here. The whole thing has a kind of moody darkness to it that's really quite extraordinary. I mean, I talked about the origins of Romanticism in France. Really by about 1790, you're really getting into that, and this is a good example of it. And for a Christian subject, it also is pretty revealing. This very tight-fitting shroud. Notice the cross up at the top, and what you get in the novella is this sort of parallel between the primitive wilderness of North America and the primitive virtues of Christianity. A kind of a deep, unspoiled purity that you have here. So this now a kind of enactment of Chateaubriand's novella. So that was in 1808, and in the same year, you have this remarkable sculpture of Napoleon's sister. This is Paulina Borghese. It's by Antonio Canova, who in some ways you can think of as a sculptural equivalent to David in some ways. I mean, he's just as David was really the great painter of his day. Canova was the really leading what we call neoclassical sculptor of his time. And what we have here is, Paulina Borghese, as I mentioned, she was Napoleon's sister. She was married off to this noble Roman family, but she was hardly faithful. I mean, she had notorious affairs, including one with the great violinist and composer Nicola Paganini. And what she wanted to be shown as the goddess Venus, the love goddess, holding an apple. So that shows her victorious. It's the story of how the Trojan War began, how Paris had to choose between the three goddesses, and he chose Venus as the most beautiful, and, he won this. And she won with this apple, which is known as the apple of discord, and that's how the Trojan War began, basically, with Helen being given to Paris, and anyway, but the Trojans not really going along with that. So she is being shown as the love goddess, which really, in many ways, goes along with her persona. I mean, that's how she wanted to be shown. So Canova was somebody who was really steeped in the example of classical sculpture, both Greek and Roman, and there are references here in the way that her physique is shown to a Greek sculpture. For example, the Venus de Milo, which was considered the most beautiful sculpture of a woman that existed. It was in the Louvre, but also to Roman sculpture, because the idea of having a reclining figure on, say, the lid of a sarcophagus was something that we had in ancient Rome. But there's something that's very 19th century about this as well. I mean, you can see how her features are idealized, that sort of continuous nose and forehead. But if you look at all the puckers in the mattress and the pillows, they're so particularized. They have what I call thinginess that's very characteristic of the 19th century. And they really come out also in this great photograph, which shows her as she would have looked by torchlight, and that's how she was shown. Apparently, Borghese, her husband, had somewhat mixed feelings about this representation of his notorious wife, and he really only let select people come in and see her, but they looked at her by torchlight, which really brings out these features in a rather remarkable way. You can see all of those wrinkles in the mattress. It has this kind of combination of abstract perfection and smoothness, and then particularity at the same time. I mean, even in that face, which is so idealized, there are some aspects that really make it look like an individualized portrait. Now, this I couldn't resist showing you. It's by the same Smith who did the scepter and the sword for the coronation, Jean-Baptiste Odiot. So it's a milk cup that was molded from the breast of Pauline Borghese. And notice the butterfly at the top. That was a very popular motif in the Napoleonic court. I mean, of course, the butterfly is an image of the soul. So all of that, if that sculpture of Paulina Borghese was from 1908, something else happened that was not so pleasant in that same year, which is that we have the beginnings of Napoleon's occupation of Spain. You know, he had all of these troops coming in, and the Spaniards did not like it, and there was an attack on his mercenaries that took place on the 2nd of May of 1808, and there was a terrible, terrible reprisal that took place afterwards, which is what we see here on the screen. This extraordinary, very large, these are roughly life-size figures in the museum in the Prado. I mean, if you go there, it's so powerful. You see the 2nd of May, which was the sort of before, and then this after. So during the occupation of Spain by Napoleon, which really begins in 1808, the Spaniards really fought back. You know, that's where the word guerrilla warfare comes from. That was really what it really means like little war, and that, you know, when I was a little kid, I thought that meant that, you know, guerrillas were attacking people. I didn't really know what that meant, but that's apparently where it came from. And Goya had seen some of the horrors, you know, the really brutal, response of the French army to the guerrilla warfare, and he actually did privately a whole series of horrifying etchings called The Disasters of War that he didn't publish in his lifetime. They weren't published until the 1860s. But he had actually been somewhat compromised because what happened is that Napoleon brought in his brother Joseph, who became the king of Spain. Goya had apparently done work for that court. So now when Napoleon falls in 1814, and we'll hear more about that, he falls for the first time. He was defeated in 1814 and sent into exile, and then he came back. And was around for about 100 days or so, and then was defeated again with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. But in 1814, when Napoleon was first defeated, Goya proposed to this sort of like ruling council at the time that he depict these two moments of, say, resistance against Napoleon, the 2nd of May and the 3rd of May. So the famous one is the 3rd of May that you see here, and after that attack on the mercenaries, all of these people who were suspected of being complicit were rounded up without a trial and shot by a firing squad. It's a really horrific thing. And what you have here, again, is a modern history painting. It's something that happened, but it's being sort of theatricalized and made to be all the more powerful and wrenching. One of the things we have is the contrast between these inhuman soldiers who seem to just sort of extend into, beyond what we can see. You know, they have this sort of robotic, anonymous quality. You know, you can only see them from behind, contrasted with the very human and very vulnerable victims who also look like they're extending in a line, to an indeterminate length, going off beyond what we can actually see. There also is a sense here of the whole thing being lit by this lantern as if it's like theatrical lighting. And the before, this man you can see who's holding his head in his hands about to enter this area where they're shooting. The man in the middle who is in the midst of this, who's throwing his arms up in looking in a pose that makes us think of Christ. In fact, one of his hands is even wounded. There is a monk who is falling, who's been shot. And then finally, so that's before, during, and then after, this man who has in basically the same pose as the one in the middle, lying in a sort of a bloody heap. This sort of before, during and after. The other thing is that it's so pessimistic, and this is one of the features of Goya that I talked about last time. Remember how he hung around with, Spaniards who were really interested in the Enlightenment, but he really is in many ways counter-Enlightenment. He is so pessimistic. And what we have is that in the background there is a monastery complex, but it's in the darkness. It's as if Christianity is completely powerless to stop this kind of horror, and just some details that figure. It really is such a famous thing. And I mean, if you go to the Prado, and I can't recommend the Prado highly enough, it's just the most extraordinary museum. I broke my record in terms of endurance. I was there for 9.5 hours at one point, after going there almost every day for a week. Anyway, I'm not sure. I think I'm a little too old for that now. But anyway, and then the bayonets with these helpless figures. Now, what happened is, I talked about last time how Goya had a terrible illness that left him deaf, and there was a relapse of the illness around the time that he painted this portrait of himself, shown very vulnerable and ill, being supported by his friend, the Dr. Arrieta, in 1822. It's a remarkably pessimistic painting. In the darkness surrounding them, you can make out these sort of vague faces that are, make me think about death closing in on them. And it has this inscription on the bottom, which really makes it into what we call an ex voto. That's a painting that is, say, dedicated to the Virgin or a saint. I mean, this is a tradition that you had in Spain, also to some extent in France earlier on, where you would have an inscription, thanking, say, the Virgin or the saint for something like being, saved from death. And so that's a very old thing, but the idea of showing himself so vulnerable in a way doesn't really belong with tradition at all. So what happens is that, as I said, Goya is deaf, and he moves, and he's seen some of these horrors of the occupation, before this, and he moves into a house called the House of the Deaf Man, and it wasn't, the name didn't come from him. Originally, it was the name given to a neighbor's house who was also deaf, really rather remarkable. And in that house, he painted a series of absolutely horrifying things, deeply pessimistic paintings. I mean, this is the most horrifying on the right. They're known as the black paintings, and this one is called Saturn devouring his son, or Saturn devouring his children, which now is in the Prado. It was originally on the wall, like it was a wall painting, but they transferred. I mean, it's been restored, and so it's hard to know exactly what it looked like originally, but regardless, it's very powerful and really sort of blood-curdling. I put it up next to an image I showed you last time. That's The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, from the Los Caprichos that we saw last time, which, as I said, is a very pessimistic image that, when reason is sleeping, you can have these horrors. But this thing, and we have no idea, it really goes beyond that. We have no idea what its size is. The space is completely ambiguous. It's just a kind of a image of sheer horror. And to bring out some of that quality, I wanted to compare it to this early Baroque painting by Annibale Carracci of Actus and Polyphemus, which is, Polyphemus is supposed to be a fearsome figure, but it's all in the spirit of fun. He is, he has sort of ideal musculature. He is not frightening in the way that the Goya is. I mean, you're really talking about the difference between the Baroque here and something which seems much more modern, which seems, something that really is truly terrifying. So I wanted to just, in passing, show you a map of the empire in 1812, which was a kind of turning point, because that was the year, and you can see how the green, which is France, is spread up into the Netherlands, and, Napoleon had really defeated so many parts of Europe, was really in control. And in 1812, he really made the mistake of invading Russia, which was his old enemy. And, you can see how Russia and the United Kingdom are not in these Napoleonic colors. They really are his, avid enemies. And it was a disaster. And I wanted to show you a rather interesting statistical map that was made later on. It was made in the late 1860s under the rule of Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, who was, during what we call the Second Empire, where there was a lot of interest in Napoleonic things. And so it's a famous, a chart just in the area of statistics because it has so much information. So what you have here, it's the attack on Russia going from west to east. That is the sort of beige band, and the width indicates the number of soldiers. And then the retreat, and you can see there's been a lot of death. It's getting very narrow, coming from Moscow. And of course, they reached Moscow. Moscow burned. We don't know exactly who set the fire. But when they retreated, they were being harassed by Russian troops, by Cossacks. And of course, eventually there was the cold. Now, it mostly took place in the autumn, but toward the end, the cold really set in. And at first, it actually was warm and sort of muddy, but what it really was famous for was this terrible cold. And what you can see, those lines going down to the bottom of that chart, those are temperature. They're in something called Ribner units, which we don't use anymore. But anyway, you can see relatively that each time it drops, there is, you can see how the death toll is going up. So that really brings us to a really powerful image by Théodore Géricault, who we're going to be looking at more in a moment, The Return from Russia, which shows the sort of forlorn solidarity between these two soldiers and this freezing dog behind them plodding through the snow. And Géricault is someone who really came of age in the wake of Napoleon. He really comes of age during the Bourbon monarchy, the restoration. The king comes back, the royal family, the Bourbons, the dynasty, comes back to France after Napoleon's defeat. Now, Napoleon's defeat, as I mentioned, he was defeated twice, first in 1814. He is exiled to the island of Elba. He comes back. The king goes back into exile, and he goes off to fight his last battle, which is the Battle of Waterloo. And what I'm showing you here is a British painting by Sir David Wilkie, showing these veterans, Chelsea pensioners, reading the Gazette of the Battle of Waterloo. So the victory, they're on the victorious side, and they're reading about the victory, and they're very excited, and it has all of this kind of activity. And later on, as I'll mention, Géricault went to England to show off his famous painting, The Raft of the Medusa. He saw this painting when it was partly finished and was terribly excited by it. So I mentioned that you have the Bourbon monarchy coming back to France. And what we have here now with this painting on the left in the Salon of 1824, this is now during the Bourbon Restoration, we have a kind of declaration of union of crown and altar, church and, you could say church and state, in this painting. And what happened is that, once the Bourbons come back, they do make Catholicism the official religion of France, and it's much more, it's not in this relationship. They don't have the same relationship to Catholicism that they did under Napoleon, where he really was dominant. It really is now a very Catholic monarchy. And what Ingres showed here, and I mentioned that he could switch his style just like David could to suit the occasion. It's an image of the 17th century monarch, Louis XIII, so that's the predecessor of Louis XIV, who is offering his crown and scepter to the Virgin of the Assumption. So it is a kind of what we call, I mentioned before the term, an ex voto, dedicating France to the Virgin. And it was shown in the Salon of 1824 and really represented a kind of full-throated endorsement of this Catholic monarchy. And what I'm showing you on the right is a famous painting by Raphael. Now, Ingres absolutely worshipped Raphael. It's in Dresden. It's called the Sistine Madonna. And you can see with those curtains up at the top how Ingres has imitated them. But it really is in a very different kind of register. For one thing, if you look at the Virgin up at the top, she is completely idealized, and in that regard might remind you of the Raphael, although she's much more hard and detailed, that thinginess that I mentioned with Canova, you can also see with Ang. But then down at the bottom, the king is in a completely different style. It's much more realistic, and it's the earthly realm and the divine realm shown here together. But I want to return to, Géricault, who was sort of hanging around with some discontents at the time. I mentioned, before I showed you Napoleon and Empire and its discontents, I was thinking especially of the Pope, Pius VII. I was thinking of Goya. But we have here discontents who are discontented with the monarchy, with the restored Bourbon monarchy. And although Géricault, we don't really know exactly what his politics were, he tended to be, it seems like he was sympathetic to these sort of leftist points of view and to discontent with the monarchy. And what he shows us here in this print is a really powerful image of confrontation. It's a Napoleonic veteran. You can see he's lost part of one of his legs, and he is showing his Legion of Honor medal. So that is an order that was established by Napoleon, really given for bravery. I mean, one of the reasons why Napoleon's army was so effective was that you advanced by, say, through your courage or your ability, not through, who your father was, through your family lineage. I mean, that was incredibly powerful. But he's showing his medal to the Swiss Guard. So the Swiss Guards were the traditional guards of the monarchy, and they come back now during the Bourbon Restoration. Swiss Guards had been massacred in 1792 when the monarchy was overthrown during the French Revolution. But now they are they're back, and so the guard is being confronted by this man who, by his hat, it was called a Bolivar hat. We can identify him as what was called a demi-solde, a half-pay, because that's what happened to these Napoleonic officers. They were sort of sent out to the provinces, put on half-pay, and put under surveillance, and so there was this kind of discontent. And Géricault had read about this in a sort of a liberal newspaper and had really been impressed by this sort of confrontation. He was really fascinated by the life of soldiers. And here is Géricault, who died so young, died in his 30s. As we'll see, this remarkable artist who really comes of age in this period, sort of post-Napoleonic period. And this remarkable head of a white horse. I mean, he loved horses. That's how he died. He died from a series of riding accidents, and he developed something I think was called tuberculosis of the spine, and that's how he died. But he was really fascinated by horses, and there's something about the way that this horse is thrusting his head into our space that really makes me think of a kind of a correspondence. There's an almost equine look in Géricault in that self-portrait, but also that horse shows you how Géricault was a great master of playing light off of dark, and we also see that in this really erotic, passionate drawing, this pair of lovers. It might be from a little bit earlier, that really giving you a sense of some of this extraordinary passion. Now, Géricault really had a rather remarkably unusual way of approaching subjects in that he tended to mix genres. That is, remember how you have history painting, you have portraiture, you have genre, which is anonymous scenes of everyday life. He could mix them all together. And in this well-known painting, the charging officer of the Imperial Guards, a large painting that was shown in the Salon of 1812. So under Napoleon, in some ways you have to ask, well, what is it? It's not an official battle painting. It doesn't commemorate a particular battle. In fact, when it was shown in the Salon, he described it as Portrait of Monsieur D, and it actually was one of his friends. I think his name is Dieudonné. But so it's, it's this really anonymous person. We don't know who he is, unless you know who that MD is. And he's not really in a particular battle. He also has this strangely contemplative look. There's a moodiness about it that just doesn't seem to go with what we would expect, say, in a painting by Gros. And he was greatly impressed by Gros' work. He was a great admirer of it. And then if this is sort of in the heat of battle during, that year of 1812, which I said was a kind of a turning point, that's the year of the invasion of Russia. He then does this large painting at the Salon of 1814, and I believe this salon was held after the fall of Napoleon, where it's this wounded cuirassier leaving the field. So it's a very large painting, but it doesn't really have a hero. He's wounded. He's leaving the field. And so it really was a kind of, it is a kind of a strange sort of thing. So what happens is that Géricault, he had some money from his father. He was able to go to Italy and study on his own. He didn't have to win the Rome Prize, which is how, say, David originally went there. And he could study, say, works of Michelangelo, ancient sculpture, things like that. And he went there, but he also went not just to study art, but in a way to get out of a very steaming relationship he had with a young aunt, and who eventually had a child. Anyway, he goes to Italy, and he's fascinated not only by these works of high art, but also by the street life. And there was one thing, and I mentioned his love of horses, that fascinated him. During the carnival, they had what was called the riderless horse race, where these Barbary horses would go racing down the Corso, a big avenue in Rome. And he wanted to do a big painting based on this. He did a number of studies. This one's especially powerful because it really seems to take the event and project it back into antiquity, with what looks like a Roman temple, and these semi-nude figures who look like they're in the poses of ancient sculptures, battling these horses, this sort of, struggling with them, this battle between humans and horses really fascinated him. And when he comes back to France, he wants to really make a sensation at the Salon, and he reads about a terrible event that took place at sea some years before this, recently, which was the nautical disaster of a frigate. So it was about the size of the USS Constitution that we have here in Charlestown, that was going to Senegal with settlers, and it ran aground, and it was something like 40 miles off the coast of what's now Mauritania. They were really stuck, and the captain, who was completely incompetent, he was someone who, unlike those Napoleonic soldiers who won the Legion of Honor through their valor, he had his position because of his family, and he brought the boat into uncharted waters. That's how they ran aground, and then there weren't enough lifeboats. There were only 6 lifeboats, and of course he and the officers got into them, and they made a makeshift raft that had something like 150 people on it, including a woman. And it was so overloaded that apparently originally the water went up to the people's waists. It was going to be towed by one of the boats, but the rope was eventually cut. And they drifted on the sea. You can imagine that, under the broiling sun for 13 days, and only about 15 of them survived. They were eventually spotted by a boat. That's what you see in this gigantic painting that Géricault painted from this, the raft of the Medusa. That tiny sail on the horizon, that was a ship called the Argus that they spotted, then it disappeared, then it came back. So Géricault shows this moment of sort of hope against hope, waving furiously at the boat, covered with corpses. This figure in the middle that you see with his back, this one right here, Delacroix, who he knew from the studio of the neoclassical painter Guérin, and who really, was terribly impressed by Géricault. He actually posed for that figure. Now, Géricault really was obsessed by this. He had read an account by 2 survivors. There was a surgeon named Savigny and an engineer named Correard, and they wrote about the raft and what had happened. He went to Normandy and studied the waves to try to get that accurate. He even had a little model with wax figures, and he visited morgues to immerse himself in death. Now, what he shows you is not at all like starving, emaciated people. They really look like athletes. And in that regard, it's very much in, you could say, the old master tradition, like that tradition of history painting. But those modern history paintings, like, for example, the Napoleonic ones, like the Pest House at Jaffa or the battlefield at Eylau, those have a hero. Napoleon is the hero. Here there is no hero, and that really shocked people. When he showed it in the Salon, it's a very big painting. These are roughly almost life-size or life-size figures. He just called it a shipwreck. He called it shipwreck scene. So in a way that mixes genres, just like we had with the charging officer. Here we have something that's obviously much more than just a shipwreck scene, but that's what it's called. It really, the political overtones of it were just too strong. I mean, this might have been a way of mitigating that, but in fact, that's all people talked about, was the political aspect. The painting itself was not particularly admired. He was very disappointed. He took it on the road to London and Dublin and actually charged admission for it, which, something that John Singleton Copley had done with some of his modern history paintings back in London earlier on. But it has this pyramid of figures. It is like something out of, say, a Rubens, these great chain of figures diagonally thrust into your space, played off against that pyramid of the sail that's blowing in the other direction. It's really in, you could say, somewhat morbid colors. Géricault is not someone who paints in rich colors, but in these dark tones. This was probably taken under bright lights because that area next to the sail, if you see it in the Louvre, is actually very, very dark. He used a kind of pigment called bitumen, which is a coal tar derivative that apparently looks really great when you first put it on, but it doesn't dry properly and is really problematic. Notice also, not just for authenticity, but also perhaps as a reference to slavery, which had been abolished in France, but was still sort of surreptitiously practiced. And he had planned before his death to do a work that had to do with the slave trade. He has one of the men at the top here, you can see, is black. And this really pathetic group on the left, it looks like perhaps a dead son and a father. It all has a kind of weightiness, a Michelangelesque quality to it that really takes it out of the ordinary. Now, the scene that he showed in some ways is a mental scene. It's this hope against hope, but he had originally thought of possibly doing something much more violent, like this study where he showed there really was apparently a mutiny on the raft, and he thought of doing that, but instead opted for this other image. I mentioned that he actually went to morgues and studied dead bodies and did, for example, this remarkable, really morbid still life of severed limbs when around the time that he was working on the Medusa, or possibly somewhat after. I mentioned that he died very young at 32 in 1824, and this is just a painting by one of his friends showing him dying. I mean, there's a passage in Delacroix's journal where he talks about having seen the dying Géricault and was terribly disturbed by it. I mean, just that this powerful, powerful artist just wasting away. And just in the short time that remains, I wanted to introduce Delacroix. Here he is, very handsome in this self-portrait from around 1837. And I don't know the date of this drawing of lion heads, but it's always struck me as so characteristically Delacroix. For one thing, the drawing style is very Baroque with these pools of light and dark. It's not a kind of drawing style like, say, Ingres did, where you have the I's dotted and the T's crossed, but it really suggests energy and movement. But also, his face has this sort of leonine quality. He loved doing, images of lions and tigers. He was fascinated by that. And in his journal, which is this great compendium of his thoughts, it's one of the great documents in the history of art, in his very last entry, really before he dies, he says that painting should be a feast for the eye, or its premier quality or merit should be as a feast for the eye. And that always makes me think of this early painting, Still Life with Lobsters, which is just this gorgeous bouquet, very odd in some ways. Why would you have this still life with lobsters in a landscape with what looks like a fox hunt going on in the background? I mean, he went to England and was really very much what we call an Anglophile. But that idea of painting being a feast for the eye, really comes out with this, comes out with this painting. I mentioned his how different his drawing style is from that of Ingres. This is a study for Ingres' Vow of Louis XIII, which I showed you before, which is really in this very classic style that really went back to central Italy. I mean, it was brought to, it's the style of, say, Raphael and Leonardo and Michelangelo. It really brings up the Italian word disegno. It was a style that was brought to France in the 16th century by Francis I, when he brought these artists like Leonardo da Vinci over to his court at Fontainebleau. And it really becomes the way that the drawing is taught. And Ingres thought you could never draw enough, that painting you could just pick up by looking at someone doing it, whereas drawing you could never get enough of. But to compare that to this lithograph by Delacroix of this wild horse coming out of the water, you can see how different it is. I mean, how it's so much more sculptural and energized, very different kind of thing. So in 1824, this was the year of the Vow of Louis XIII that we saw earlier. In the same salon, you have this face-off, but you could say, between the two artists, and they came to be seen as sort of polar opposites. You have this large painting by Delacroix, Scenes from the Massacres at Chios, from also in the Salon of 1824. A scene from contemporary history, so you could say it's a modern history painting. This time it had to do with the Greek War of Independence, the Greeks fighting for independence against the Ottoman Empire. And this was a particular episode that was especially horrifying, where a huge Ottoman army came to the island of Chios and massacred and brought off into slavery huge numbers of people, like something like 20,000 people were killed or something like that. I mean, it was an incredible sort of thing. And Delacroix read about this and wanted to do, just like as Géricault did that Raft of the Medusa, do a kind of powerful painting to show at the Salon. And this painting, it's very rich colors. It's very unlike the work of Géricault in that regard. And it's not like Ingres, where you have these, in Ingres you have what you call strong local colors. All the colors are very separate and bounded. In Delacroix, you have this sort of ambient color. It's as if it's in the atmosphere, really coming from the tradition, say, of Rubens, of Titian, artists that he could have studied in the Louvre. I mean, that's really how he and Géricault got their main education, studying in those works in the Louvre. But it's a kind of combination of exoticism, cruelty, and eroticism at the same time. What you have are these dead and dying figures in the foreground. There is this nude woman who's being carried off by one of the Ottoman soldiers. And this pathetic image of it looks like a child reaching for its mother's breast. It looks like the mother may be dead. And the way that there is not only no hero here, like there was, no hero in the Raft of Medusa, but there's no center. It's sort of split apart. And even though Delacroix, like Géricault, was a great admirer of the work of Gros, Antoine-Jean Gros, Gros really was very shocked by this painting. He called it it was called The Massacres at Chios. He called it the massacre of painting because he saw this as just completely incomprehensible. And it has these extraordinary rich colors. It has this sense of both, cruelty and death, exoticism, and also, that whole reveling in paint that we saw already earlier in the Still Life with Lobsters. So a number of years later, so that's about 6 years later, so that's 1824, the Bourbon monarchy is overthrown. They pass a series of ordinances that get rid of freedom of the press. I think they dissolve the legislative chamber. There is an uprising for 3 days that is successful. It overthrows the Bourbon monarchy. That's the end of the Bourbon monarchy in France. And a new monarchy is brought in, but it's not the Bourbon family. It's from the Orléans family. It's somebody named King Louis Philippe. And initially, at least, there was great enthusiasm and hope that this was going to have to be a kind of a reign of liberty. And Delacroix, who actually was quite conservative, although, I mean, he was very he was very much revered the Napoleonic tradition. I mean, his father had been a Napoleonic official. 2 of his brothers had been, really heroic officers for Napoleon. But what you have here is a commemoration of the origin of this new regime. And it's very famous. The figure of liberty up at the top used to be on the 100-franc bill. I mean, it's just so famous. And it's a remarkable thing because it's, again, one of these modern history paintings. But this one really does have a hero, or a heroine, that is. And you can see that it's a barricade. I mean, that's how street fighting was done in 19th century France. That's strewn with these bodies, but all of that death seems to be worthwhile because it's going up into a great pyramid. And at the summit of the pyramid, you have the tricolored French flag, which was the flag of Napoleon, the flag of the Revolution. It was really outlawed during the Bourbon Restoration when they brought back the white flag with fleur-de-lis. That was the Bourbon flag. And so this is really a affirmation of that tradition coming back, of this, and the way that Liberty, who looks like she could be a woman of the people, but somehow is very generalized. She is partly nude, and she's wearing this hat, this Phrygian cap. It's the cap of liberty, or it was worn by freed slaves in ancient Rome. So it really has this kind of full-throated allegory of, think about the Statue of Liberty, later on, as an allegory, a representation of liberty. This is a sort of an ancestor of that. And Delacroix, who is such a brilliant colorist, really makes the colors, the blue, white, and red of that flag sort of resonate throughout the painting. And so with that, I'm going to stop, and we'll hear more about this painting and about Delacroix in the lecture after the next one. So I'll see you then. Take care. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Oh, I think they'll bring by a microphone.
Yes, we have time for one question. I'll be down to you in just a second.
Thank you. The Art Institute of Chicago, many years ago, I was trying to figure out who is the artist, Giraudais. They had a major exhibit of his work. And after all these years, that was a long time ago, I had gone up to look at this beautiful chocolate brown that he did. It may have been like a velvet fabric. It was so beautiful. Just a little square, 1.5 by 2. There was just so much, the way that he attained that was just incredible. And I still remember that little square of that very beautiful and color I never saw ever before. So what a master at that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Giraudais is a fascinating artist. I mean, he did wonderful portraits. He tended to go in for things that were very extreme, like eroticism and violence and things like in some of his other paintings. But he was a really brilliant student of David. I mean, in some ways he was very eccentric, but later on, like in the 1820s, he was really thought of as a great master of tradition, as somebody who just as Ingres. I mean, Ingres started out really rather eccentric and was somewhat criticized. Like I mentioned, the Napoleon on his imperial throne of 1806 was criticized, but by 1824, when he did the vow of Louis XIII, he was really held up as this great, he is tradition. So that, in some ways, that happened with Girodet as well.
Okay, thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, thank you.